Welcome back to the Physical Educator. Today we're going to talk about principles of training and program design. We're going to start, as we usually do, with the assessment objectives. A small but very important unit to go through now, principles of training. As you can see, there's no objective ones, so we need to go into a little bit of detail with each of these aspects of this unit. So let's get straight into it. First, we need to outline the essential elements of a general training program. So like with any training program, the first thing you need to do is warm up. Within your warm up, there's three parts. We have a pulse raiser, generally something to get your heart rate going, something to increase your pulse, hence the name, warm the muscles up, get them a little bit more elasticated before we can move on to the next stage of the warm up, which is the dynamic stretches. Now, dynamic stretches are used more in a warm up than static stretches, and the research suggests that dynamic stretches increase your range of movement on a short-term basis, so therefore you're prepared for the activity you're about to go into. Dynamic stretches aren't fantastic for increasing flexibility, and we'll come to that later, but they're brilliant as a warm-up to increase the range of movement, prevent injury during the exercise. It's important to do the stretches after the pulse raiser because your muscles need to be warm before you stretch. I use an analogy here, chewing gum. Think about a long piece of chewing gum. If you try and stretch it immediately, it snaps. If you put it in your mouth and you chew it and you warm it up, you take it out of your mouth and you stretch it, it lengthens, and it lengthens considerably. Similar thing with your muscles. Obviously chewing gum tastes nicer than muscles, but it's the same process that happens. If you warm your muscles up and then stretch, you'll be able to go further into your range of movement and also prevent injury. The last aspect of a warm-up is a related activity to the sport you're about to play. If you're about to go into a basketball match, it makes sense to get the ball out. It makes sense, do some handling, do some dribbling. Even when you're a better basketball player, you might use 2 basketballs to really focus on warming up for the activity. Do some shots, some passing, bit of team play, maybe 1v1 defending, and then you're ready for the game. And you've prepared your mind as well as your body for the activity that you're about to do. Next is endurance training. Now, endurance training is vital in all sports. To do endurance training, you need to be at 60 to 80% of your heart rate maximum. And the fitter an athlete you are, the closer to 80% this will be. The closer to 80% this is of your maximum, the more fitness gains will take place. Therefore, you'll become a fitter athlete, more endurance. It's got to be specific. If you're a swimmer, you don't want to be on a treadmill 3 times a week. I mean, you might do that for variance, but what you want to be doing is training in the environment that you're playing. That's what you want to do here with your endurance training. We also need to target muscle groups. You want to target the muscle groups that are needed for your performance. At the end of a session, you need to consider a cool down with stretches. This can be neglected sometimes, definitely more so than a warm-up, but a cool down is crucial. You gradually bring your heart rate back down to a resting state. This is important to prevent blood pooling. You might have done a fitness test before, like the bleep test, let's say, and you might have jumped on the floor afterwards because you're gasping for air. And hopefully your teacher's told you to stand up and maybe stand against a wall, put your hands on your head, and this encourages deep breathing in this gradual process. But to make that even better, the cool down, even as tired as you are after a session, even if it's a slow walk or if you can manage a slow jog just for a few minutes, it gradually brings the heart rate back down to a resting state in a healthy way. Static stretches are used here instead of dynamic stretches. In your warm-up, you'd hold a dynamic stretch for maybe 10 seconds. The static stretches are held for 30 seconds. And static, as it sounds, there's no movement. You hold the stretch for 30 seconds. You feel the pain within the muscle. Then you might have a shake of the muscle, do your other leg if it's your legs you're doing. Then you might go back and have another go for 30 seconds. And a couple of times at that in a cool down are vital. This can really improve your flexibility, but it can also massively prevent injury. And that's what cool downs are for. They're to prevent further injury. So flexibility training as part of your training program, you can do PNF stretching, which we'll cover more in option A. You can do stretches like we've already discussed, dynamic and static, and they've also yoga and Pilates examples that many elite sports now adopt within their training program. Next is resistance training, really important for many sports, vital in today's world because not only are we doing resistance training to prepare ourselves for the performance, either by doing bodyweight exercises, using weights, but we're also doing weights and bodyweight exercises for preventing injury. There's a lot of prevention work done in the gym these days with elite athletes. It's not just about getting sharp, getting in good shape for the performance. They do exercises that prevent injury. You have athletes now like LeBron James, 17 years into his NBA career, still an unbelievable athlete, still doing as many minutes as anybody else. You've got Cristiano Ronaldo, who again is 35, and he's no sign of letting up with his goal-scoring records that he's breaking. And it's happening more and more now where these athletes are going later into their career in fantastic shape, not really getting injured, looking after themselves unbelievably, because of this prevention work that can come from resistance training, as well as the resistance training that's done to improve performance. There's 3 different ways you can do resistance training to increase your performance. It's power, strength, or endurance, and it's all dependent on reps and weight. If you use more weight with less reps, you're going to be doing power. It's a more powerful movement because it's a heavier object you're moving, and you're really forcefully moving it. A couple of reps, and then you'd stop and rest. Strength is not quite as high weight, but more reps. Usually 8 to 12 reps of a heavy weight would be strength. Endurance, it'd be a much lighter weight and you do many reps. You could do anything from 15 plus in repetitions, even sometimes up to 25, 30, depending on what sport you're doing. A basketball player might work on tricep shoulder movement numerous times. A golfer might work on the torso, twisting numerous times. Whatever sport it is, you will work on them muscle groups repeatedly. And lastly, we've got recreational activities. So recreational activities, this is really important, particularly in elite sport. And there's many reasons why you do alternative activities within your training program. It focuses on additional components of fitness, ones that you might not think of or ones that you might not train within your training program. But it's still worthwhile to develop them for your performance. Secondly, it's good for motivation because it's a bit of a break from the monotonous training that you might be doing. It's something interesting, it's a different way to challenge your body. And lastly, if it's a team game, it's a brilliant way to build team spirit and teamwork amongst a group of individuals. Cricket is a great example here. They're forever playing five-a-side football and tennis and other activities just to really develop this team ethos, motivate the players and work on different components of fitness. Next, we need to discuss the key principles for training program design. First, we've got progression, and it is, as it sounds, a gradual increase in the workload of exercises. And this is done to avoid plateauing your level of fitness. Remember the word plateau? We went through it with the Principles of Skill Learning video, so revisit that video if you need a reminder. But what we're trying to avoid here is a plateau. What we're trying to do is continue the fitness gains, to get better, to get bigger, to get stronger, to get faster, whatever the goal is. And we need to progress our training in order to do that. Now, the way we progress training is to overload. So when we overload training, we can do it in 3 ways. We can either overload frequency, which is how many times you train in a week. We can overload the intensity, which is how hard you train. And/or, so you can either do all of these or one of them or 2 of them, the duration, so the time that you train for. And by applying any of these, you are overloading your training. You are progressing your training. So an example might be, instead of doing 2 sessions a week, you might move to 3, that's frequency. Intensity, instead of working at 70% of your heart rate maximum, you might go for 75. And duration, as it sounds, you might go from 45 minutes to 60 minutes for your session. Next, we've got the training itself and its specificity. Now, you've heard this word before for study design. So although it's slightly different here, it means the same thing, and you're making it specific to the performer. So if you're a swimmer, you're training in the pool. If you're a football winger, you might be working on agility. Whereas if you're a football central defender, you might be working on power in your legs to jump up to head the ball. So there's many different ways you can be specific. It's not just to the sport, it's also to the position. Another example here is saying, I'm going to make my training specific to rugby. Well, is it going to be a forward, where they're the bigger, stronger guys who normally make all the tackles and at the ruck? Or is it going to be a back who is still strong, but more agile because they need to break the lines with the ball to try and gain yards. So it's different depending on the type of performer that you are. We have to be specific to that. And we've also got reversibility. Now this is the one that you want to avoid. It can be brought about by injury, so therefore you stop training and reversibility can take place, meaning the gains that you have made have been lost. Reversibility can also happen because of demotivated athletes or a lack of progressive overload where you plateau and therefore your performance doesn't increase anymore, your body doesn't increase anymore, therefore reversibility can set in. There's a general rule of thumb here. You lose fitness twice as fast as you gain it. So if you do a 4-week training program, the gains that you had will be lost within 2 weeks. If only it was the other way around. Variety prevents boredom. This is vital to motivate athletes and to provide a desire to keep progressing and keep maintaining them required intensity levels. And lastly, we've got periodization. Now again, I'll go through this more in the option A video, but this is genuinely when training is performed in cycles. So each cycle differs in intensity, specificity, and the volume of work within it. So when you cycle your training, the body adapts to the changing environment, it adapts to the changing stress that the body is under, and therefore you can hit peak performances at different times of the season. So boxers, athletes use periodization within their training, so when they hit peak mode, they're ready to perform. And finally, we need to outline ways in which exercise intensity can be monitored. So, heart rate predicts exercise intensity. It's a very well-known fact. It's used very, very often. Heart rate increases in line with exercise intensity, which is exactly why it's used to predict the intensity that you're working at. It also indicates the maximum volume of oxygen that can be consumed, VO2 max. Some ways we've used heart rate to predict exercise intensity. We've all probably put our index finger and our middle finger on our wrist to our radial pulse, or we might have put it on our neck to our carotid pulse before, and we've taken that pulse reading, and that's an indicator of exercise intensity or fitness, depending on which way you want to view it and why you're taking your heart rate. Remember never to use your thumb when you take your heart rate because it can generate its own pulse and you might miss your beat. Other ways we can take heart rate, a bit more technical, and particularly with technology increasing so rapidly at the moment, is very quick ways to take your heart rate. Most of you have probably used the machine on the screen now in the doctors. Some of you may have used them in school for sports science, IAs. Personally, I have used this for the IA. It's brilliant, it's really quick. It doesn't interfere with the actual exercise that's taking place, so therefore you can get good quick readings of heart rate or oxygen saturation percentage, which you want to be above 95, which is currently on the screen now. And also heart rate monitors. It's on your wrist, it can be your iWatch, or it can be the belt that you wear underneath your nipple line. But what does heart rate tell us? Heart rate tells us many, many things. Now we can calculate maximum heart rate by doing 220 minus our age. We can calculate resting heart rate by being sat in a resting position and taking heart rate via one of the methods that has just been on the screen. Training heart rate zones can be calculated based on a percentage of your maximum heart rate, and we'll go through that in a second. Recovery rate is when you finish exercising and you take your heart rate every minute after exercise for 5 minutes. The idea of a recovery rate is an indicator of fitness. The sooner you can get back to your resting heart rate, it can be inferred that you are fitter than somebody who might take longer to get back to their resting heart rate. Because what it implies is that your heart is bigger and stronger. It implies that your vessels are healthier, and therefore the oxygen demand is less required in the muscles quicker because it can be supplied by the heart faster in the recovery. So we've got different heart rate zones. The bottom one, moderate activity, this is a maintenance or a warm-up zone really, and it's up to 60% of your heart rate maximum. You're not going to get fitter in this zone, but it's a nice way to warm up without overstressing your muscles too quickly. Or if you're injured, it's a nice method for maintenance because you're not going to put your body under too much stress, but yet reversibility isn't going to kick in as much because you're still able to move. These are things like underwater walking or running, where it's less stressful, or even walking itself, if possible, just to do something as maintenance. 60 to 70% is fat burn. And this is when you see people, again, walking uphill on a treadmill, going for long distance walking, very, very light jog. It's great for fat burning. It's low level exercise. Your fat's going to be your main source of energy, but you're not going to get fitter. To get fitter, you have to be hitting really high end 60%, 70% and plus. And that's your aerobic target zone. This is where your endurance will increase. And the higher in this zone, obviously the fitter you will be. Once you go above the 80% mark, you've entered your anaerobic target zone. And this now means that you're training without oxygen. You're not really going to be able to maintain this for long. And this is where interval training or HIIT training is really good, because you can go into this training zone and back out and back into it and back out. Or if you're an elite athlete or someone who's really challenging yourself, you can train above 90% of your heart rate maximum. These percentages are not set in stone. They're different by individual, they're different by gender, they're different by fitness, they're different by body size, they're different by many things. But what's key here as well is that they can change. And the more you train, the higher up these percentages go. And you might ask why that's important. Well, remember when I said if you go above the 80% mark, you're now training without oxygen. Well, imagine if your aerobic threshold wasn't at 80%. Imagine it was at 90%. So now you can exercise at 90% of, or 89%, just under it, of your heart rate maximum for a long time, because you haven't crossed that threshold, and you can still use your heart to pump oxygen around your body to maintain that level of training. That is massive, and that's key. And that's what elite endurance athletes have. Their anaerobic threshold is high 80s, if not early 90%. There's a video of Mo Farah on a treadmill, running at the speed he runs the 10K at, and obviously he can maintain that for the whole race. And then average people have attempted to maintain this speed on the treadmill, and they last for about 5 or 10 seconds. Either the legs give way or the heart cannot provide any more oxygen, and they just hit lactic acid so quick they can't maintain it. And this is because elite athletes, amongst all the other advantages they have over amateur athletes, have a higher anaerobic threshold. Therefore, they can use oxygen at a much higher intensity for much longer. Therefore, obviously, if you were racing them on long distance, they'd clearly beat us. Another method for measuring exercise intensity is something called the Carvonian method. Now, we've already mentioned that 220 minus your age is a great indicator for fitness. It's nice and simple to do. 220, if you're 20 years of age, boom, your maximum heart rate is 200. But the Corvona method just takes it a little bit further and is a little bit more accurate. And this is how it works. So we've got a trained athlete with a lower resting heart rate. And that's because they have a relationship between stroke volume, cardiac output and heart rate that's working really effectively for them. But this is the Corvona method. Let's say you're 20 and your resting heart rate is lower than somebody else your age. Because remember, if we just do 220 minus your age, both of your maximum heart rate is 200. But if we consider now two 20-year-olds with different fitness levels, one is fitter than the other. What you would infer is the fitter one has a lower resting heart rate. And, you know, if you're unsure about that, revisit the CV video and that'll go through it for you. So if you're fitter, you've got a slightly lower heart rate than the not so fit athlete. What does this mean? This means that your resting heart rate might be 60 for the unfit athlete. 220 minus 20 equals 200. 200 minus 60, which is the resting heart rate, which is the Corvona method, gives 140. What you would do is multiply 140 by the exercise intensity. So let's say you're going to go at 80% of your maximum. That's 140 times 0.8, which is 112. 112 plus the resting heart rate again, to complete the Corvona method, is 112 plus 60. And that's 172 beats per minute. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let's run the same formula again for a fitter athlete with a fitter resting heart rate. So now our 20-year-old has a resting heart rate of 50 beats per minute. 200 minus 50 is 150. Already it's different. 150 times 0.8 is 120, not 140. 120 plus 50, because that's the resting heart rate, remember, gives us 170. So now the anaerobic threshold will be at 170 beats per minute and not 172. Doesn't seem like much difference, but if you're asking these two athletes to run on a treadmill side by side for 30 minutes or cycle on a bike for an hour, because if you ask them to work at the same beats per minute, the unfit athlete would have to work considerably harder to maintain it. So this is just a really accurate way of giving a maximum heart rate to people of the same age with different fitness levels. The last method for measuring exercise intensity is called perception. And there's three ways we can do this. There's three scales that we can use. Firstly, we have the Borg scale, which is out of 20. How hard are you working out of 20? Now this has obvious flaws, because it's not as technical as using a heart rate. It's factual. This is what your heart rate is. This is how hard you are working. This is, this is an opinion. This is how hard I feel I'm working. And the person next to you could have a very different threshold for pain, and therefore might say they're working harder than you when they're not, or they might say they're not working as hard as you, etc. So it has obvious flaws. But it's a great method if you can't take heart rate. At least it's something and some way of tracking how hard somebody's working. Of course, the other one is that people could lie. They could be trying to be too proud and say it's not as hard as it is. So it's only a 12, but yet they're blowing and they're really struggling. Other methods are called the Omni scale, measured out of 10. Not as accurate as the Borg scale, because there's obviously less numbers, therefore there's less scope to have variance within performance, but you will need to know the difference between the Omni scale and the Borg scale, and the main difference is that the Omni scale is out of 10, the Borg scale is out of 20. And lastly, we have the CERT scale, also measured out of 10, so similar to the Omni scale with regards to being out of 10, but the CERT scale is used with children, and the levels of intensity are slightly different out of 10 for children whilst performing. And that's our three methods of exercise intensity monitoring that aren't factual. Other ways we do it are by using heart rate in a variety of ways. Point on Unit 6, including statistical analysis with standard deviation, t-tests and correlation, including QR codes and suggested reading, as well as study design, different types of tests, components of fitness, and principles of training. Visit the TES website and check out the Physical Educator channel there. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.